Okay, so I think we've got all of our panelists here. So I think maybe we'll start as the recording is going. So welcome everyone along to the panel. It's great to have you all here, and thank you to the panelists for uploading your videos and sharing all your work with us. Just before we get going, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping just so that everyone knows. Panelists, if you do have any screens or diagrams to share, you will be able to share your screens. I know some people have not got very good internet connection, or you're a bit concerned that it might not be working brilliantly. If it means you need to keep your cameras off to improve the internet speed, then by all means, please do. That's not an issue at all. The way we're going to do the panel is we're going to give each of the paper presenters 5 minutes. So we've gone slightly rogue from the suggested 2 minutes of the DSA. But after we've done the presentation, so panelists, if you could just focus really on your presentation and kind of the main takeaways from it in those 5 minutes, that would be brilliant. And then we can come back to, I know we sent you some questions yesterday, we can come back to those questions afterwards. If anyone who's not a panelist, not quite sure how to refer to you, but welcome. If anyone has any questions, please make use of the chat, or feel free to use your virtual hand in Zoom to ask any questions. We'll try and keep an eye on the questions in Zoom and on the hands. As you know, the panel's being recorded so people can watch it again later. And as I've said, we will try and keep to the 40 minutes time slot so that people have a chance to get a break before the next one. So I should probably introduce myself. My name is Helen Hawthorne. I'm one of the co-conveners, and Valerie, who is also here, is the other co-convener for the Business and Development group. So our panel today really is looking at alternative ideas in terms of development and development perspectives for transforming economies for climate, nature and society. So how businesses can interact with this. And we posed a series of questions to the panelists, which you can find on the program for the panel. So we have 3 papers for you today. We have, the first one is about transition townships. We have Professor Janet Cherry, Patrick Brennan and Anthony Martel from the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Now, second paper is by Claire Cummings. It's looking at mining in El Salvador. So these two are both kind of case studies of specific cases, and Claire is from the University of Manchester. And then our final paper is looking at post-materialism and the fetishism of the environmental consciousness, the case of the USA, which is by Marina Roquena y Mora, Dan Rockington and Forrest Fleischman, and we have Marina here today. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to the presenters. We'll run in that order. So if I hand over to Janet and Patrick and Tony, I think is Tony here as well. I'll hand over to you guys. If you could give us, say, 5 minutes about your paper, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll present on our presentation. I don't know if my video is working. So yeah, thank you very much and good afternoon. I would say that Janet and Patrick are responsible primarily, and also the members of the community, for coming up with this project, but I'll give a presentation on it. So just very short, in terms of like what we're looking at, is basically a strategy for sustainable development that sees the most effective means of doing so as locating this process within the hands of everyday people, and that by those means, basically determining means of allocating their own resources and provision of services and goods from within the community. And that this will have ecological and substantive, like economic and social implications for these people, that is a means of empowerment. So just to clarify, like the conception of transition township, so it's a twofold definition. As it's generally conceived, it's through like basically transitioning away from carbon emissions. But and that is one facet of the definition, but it's in a deeper sense also about transitioning toward a new model of economic development. And this is where, you know, working class communities control their own resources. So the methodological approach, since this is a pilot project from a university, we're looking at this from also a research perspective, and as an action project, you know, it's a participatory action research, but we also are thinking about this as an ambiguous sort of term, because a lot of people, you know, even corporations, are talking about participation and such. So this is a much more substantive sense of empowering like the everyday people to basically, as what had occurred in this project, of basically implementing the research process themselves. So in that sense, it's almost like a people's action research. You know, it's the deepest sense of empowerment. At least that's what we're striving to do. So, you know, like I said, it's basically using the existing infrastructure and resources in, you know, this location where we are in Nelson Mandela Bay in South Africa, you know, a city on the coast, southern coast of South Africa, in a township. So it's in a poor community within the municipality here. That you know, basically they're creating livelihoods through the provision of goods that they source themselves. And so for us, there's two pillars for this. It's energy democracy. So it's the sourcing and distribution of this in an equitable manner and through a sustainable means. So it's solar power generation. And Patrick, if you've watched the presentation, Patrick, you would have said something about that, and also through food production. So basically vegetable production that is sold to local grocery stores and such. And so, you know, as a question that we'll pose, you know, after giving you these basic tenets of like our presentation and the project, the actual implementation of any project has very many obstacles, and not the least of which we didn't really get to touch on, come from institutions. So one question that we kind of talked about was, you know, to ask whether and how, you know, because this is a big question, you know, is it worthwhile? How do we like modify and adapt to institutions to develop the kind of political projects, the kind of world that we want to see? Or is it necessary that we have to build our own institutions? And so that's basically the, you know, basic gist of what the Transition Township project is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anthony. That is excellent and very well timed, which makes it easier. Thank you very much. So next we'll move on to Claire Cummings and her case study on El Salvador and the mining in El Salvador. Claire, if you would like to take over. Thanks.
Yeah, great. I hope you can hear me okay. So my presentation comes from my doctoral project. It's a case study of institutional change in El Salvador. It's a secondary case study, so drawing on other people's documentation of this case, in which El Salvador introduced a de facto mining ban in 2007, and then it became legislation in 2017. And I use this case study to try to show the importance of considering cultural power alongside economic and political power when we examine institutional change and try to understand why it happened. So I draw on work by Simon Jessup and others who use cultural political economy frameworks, and I try to argue for a broader understanding of power in this sense. So looking at cultural values and ideas, as well as the more usual focus on political power and economic interests. So in this case, it's a case study. In the early 2000s, metal mining began in El Salvador with the presence of international mining companies. But mining didn't really become well established before rural communities began protesting about the pollution from the mining, which was affecting their water supply. And these these communities in the mining area had a legacy of left-wing ideology after the fairly recent civil war, and were already skilled in political mobilization and quickly grew their campaign into other communities across El Salvador. And they formed alliances with international NGOs. They were then able to convince the then Archbishop of the Catholic Church in El Salvador that mining was polluting their environment, and that this was a collective responsibility, and they gave a religious argument as well, which the Catholic Church agreed to and then became heavily involved in the campaign. The presence of the Catholic Church gave the campaign a really strong moral authority, which then translated into greater political power, as the then right-wing government, which was already politically weak, was forced to take on these concerns, which had become held by a large portion of the population. So in 2007, they passed a de facto ban. But in retaliation, Pacific Rim, the Canadian mining company, took them to court, and they used the World Bank Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes to argue for lost revenue. However, the case dragged on for a few years, but eventually the court found that Pacific Rim did not have access, the correct access to the land in which they were mining, and so they were forced to withdraw, and then that left the space clear for government to pass the de facto ban into law. So what I think that this case study shows is obviously an unusual case of mining actually being banned in the interests of rural communities' livelihoods. And it shows, I think, that the environment and ecology is an important material structure, but it can be accorded different values. And while capitalist interests are obviously important in understanding the change process, they were not the sole determinant. And in fact, ideas about traditional livelihoods, human dignity, like a shared responsibility for a resource which affected most of the population of El Salvador, these values contradicted the purely commercial value given to the environment, and ultimately allowed the institutional change to occur. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. I'm very impressed. Everyone's really sticking to their time, so that's fantastic. Thank you. And then just to introduce our final paper on the fetishism of environmental consciousness, we have Marina.
Okay. So I will share my screen. So briefly, in this paper, Dan Bookington, Forrest Fishman, and myself will challenge the conventional view that economic growth raises environmental concern, as postulated by Engelhard postmaterialist thesis as well. Probably it is represented in this figure. You can see how GDP growth is pretty much related with the preference of protecting the environment. So instead, we argue that we must be attentive to the types of environmentalism, different economic regimes, and gender. We analyzed two types of evidence. First, the Gallup survey from 1990 to 2021. And also we try to understand the evolution of the material footprint per capita, which is an indicator that measures the global allocation of used raw material extraction to the final demand of the economy. As we can see in this figure, that probably it's the best way to summarize our results. The percentage of people in favor of protecting the environment, which is the green line, rises with GDP per capita in T-1, the red line. and declines when it drops. Thus far, our findings support a key component of the post-materialist thesis: economic growth and professed environmental consciousness co-vary. As economic growth, so does environmental consciousness. So Engelhardt's thesis asserts that environmental concern increases with GDP does. But what does this concern do for the environmental in material terms? What are the material consequences of the post-materialist thesis? So according to these regressions, GDP growth, again the red line, has a positive impact on the material footprint growth, see the gray line. So that is, the higher the GDP growth, the larger the footprint. But we also found that the preference to protect the environment also grows as past values of the material footprint per capita does. This means that paradoxically, we are more concerned about the environment only when we are already having and continue to have a high environmental impact. Therefore, the percentage of people in favor of protecting the environment over economic growth drops when the material footprint went down, because both decline when GDP growth declines. We can argue so the worst periods for environmental consciousness coincide with the best measures of environmental health and the worst periods for the economic growth. See, for instance, what has happened in the pandemic crisis, which is this last period. So one could argue that the causal mechanism between the preference of protecting the environment and material footprint is clear. We care less about the environment during crisis because the environmental degradation also decreases. However, we have also conducted qualitative research about social opinions on the environment. What we found in the qualitative research is that the post-material thesis was rhetorically correct. The results indicate environmental consciousness is a product of economic growth. People seem to care less about the environment during crisis because, as expressed by one interviewee, there are more important things such as employment. So finally, we could argue that the historical and social specificities of post-materialism promote a particular social representation of an alienation from the environment, which hinges on separation of life practices from the environmental impact that these practices have been producing. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. That's really interesting. Interesting that you've also been doing some qualitative research to back up the other data as well. That's fascinating. Okay, so Valerie and I put together some questions that we put to the presenters or sent to the presenters yesterday, but I'm just wondering whether there are any questions from anyone in the group first. There are a few on the chat, so maybe if I raise those. Valerie, did you want to?
So far they're just from me to add to our other questions, but well, Tony might come in and explain at this point in addition to answering the other questions. I don't know about which examples of institutions he was thinking of, because he teased with us about this point about how far you can work with existing institutions and adapt and dance with them, and how far you really have to change them to sort of transform economies and really put them in the hands of communities. So I was interested, like, just for a practical example. And on Claire's, there was a question about, I just thought particularly from the presentation, hearing again today about the role of the Catholic Church, as well as of the International, the World Bank dispute resolution mechanisms seemed key, but this broader constellation of things that came together to lead to a sort of more positive outcome. And I wondered if there were other cases that she'd come across, and particularly perhaps around the role of the Catholic Church. Thanks.
Okay, Tony and Claire, would you like to come back on those questions?
Yeah, I can say something briefly. I don't think out of all the panelists, I'm necessarily the best to answer these in great depth, but these are issues like involving, for example, trying to set up the cooperatives in this pilot project where we're working. So, for example, working with the financial regulatory regime, in South Africa, as would be the case in likely any political economic context in the current day, there's many obstacles to actually making a project that sort of operates according to a logic that's distinctive from profiting large wealthy like interests, let's say. And also the political dynamics within a local context of confronting new elected officials when the project persists beyond an electoral cycle. There are also logics within these particular institutions that benefit from the way things go as they currently do, and that's the reason why these institutions to some degree exist as they already do. Yeah, I mean, as I said, with any project that actually occurs on the ground, there's going to be many challenges, and there's going to be new problems that you face. And I think in general, this is one that is going to be pertinent for any practical implementation of, let's say, a sustainable development that is going to be in the hands of everyday people, and it's going to be distributed democratically, both economically and politically.
Maybe if I could just sort of add to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So you'll see in the presentation we're using a model to understand how development is occurring that we've taken from David Harvey in his book on the enigma of capital, which was written in response to the 2008 crisis, where he brings up these 7 activity spheres that capital revolves through: technology and organizational forms, social relations, institutional and administrative arrangements, production and labor processes, relations to nature, reproduction of daily life, and then mental conceptions of the world. So what we're trying to do is understand our environment through the lens of these these activity spheres at various different levels. And in terms of things like technology and labor processes, those kind of things, South Africa's working class, compared maybe to other parts of the world, is relatively able to engage in those terrains. But when it comes to things like institutions and let's call it the mental conceptions by which our current political economy is being governed, we run into problems. So in theory, we can produce electricity using solar panels, and we can monitor it on mobile phones and all that kind of thing. We can pump it into the grid. But in practice, we can do those things technologically, and we can do them. We can adopt the processes. We can get the people in the community to actually physically do the things. But getting the system to pay for the electricity that we produced is a much more cumbersome and difficult thing to do. And part of what we're saying is that the institutions we have are they're about 30 or 40 years out of date in terms of what they are trying to do. So there's an economic development model that's called, I hesitate to call it neoliberalism because it's not entirely the case in South Africa. There's a social democratic component as well, but it's not appropriate for the kind of democratization that's now possible using these new technologies. Things that used to be natural monopolies are now, it's possible to do them in a much more distributed form. And we've proved that you can do it technologically, but getting the system to getting the banking system to provide a bank account for a cooperative is a nightmare. Getting the city council to implement its own policy of buying electricity from locally produced independent generators is difficult, and so on and so on. So I won't go into too much detail, but what kind of what we're saying is that there's an opportunity here with new technology which is not being realized because people don't see the sort of ordinary citizens as being, fully able to participate, when in fact they are able to participate. And again, in our research, we've proved that.
Thanks for that, Patrick. That's really kind of helped to answer some of the questions that I had as well in terms of your use of David Harvey. Can we just go back to Claire? So there was a question for Claire.
Yeah, thank you. For a question about whether there are other cases. Unfortunately, I don't know of other cases which are quite so successful. I think one case of a similar type was in 2016. Uruguay government passed quite strict legislation on tobacco advertising. So not exactly the environment, but it was around public health, like public interest. And the Philip Morris Tobacco Corporation took them to court, again using the World Bank investment dispute mechanism, and they lost. So again, it was a kind of landmark case showing that international institutions can actually hold corporate power to account and allow domestic legislation to change. So I thought that again was an interesting case, and I think one of the questions which you circulated earlier about the role of international investment dispute mechanisms being sort of interesting and having an important role in trying to mediate the impact of corporate power on communities' health is an interesting one, and something I'd like to look into a lot more theoretically. Especially I find it kind of ironic in the El Salvador case that you have this, ultimately it was a capitalist institution which prevented the mining company from doing the mining, like it was about property rights and land rights. And normally the kind of institution in El Salvador was not strong enough to prevent the mining company from going ahead, but it was ultimately international actors which held them to account. So that I found that quite interesting. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Actually, just on that question of litigation, there was an article yesterday in the Financial Times about a Peruvian person taking a German company to court because of kind of legacy environmental disruption. So it's been interesting ones that I think becomes much more important as we go forward. I can see that Janet's got her hand up, and I know you put a question, or you wanted to respond to Claire's paper as well, Janet. So would you like to?
Yeah, thanks. So I thought maybe while we're on this topic of the mining in El Salvador, I could follow up with some of the dynamics around extractives and struggles. This is not related to the paper that Tony and Patrick and I presented. Well, it's indirectly related, but there have been two really important struggles in South Africa around extractives. And, the South African economy is very highly centralized and highly dependent on commodity exports. And it's actually deindustrialized. And we're looking at a model in response to climate change, which is looking at localized production to meet people's basic needs, really. And that includes food and energy and so on. So it relates to all these questions about, is a circular economy appropriate? How can we localize the economy? How can we make it more democratic and more egalitarian? South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. I think it's even more unequal than Brazil at the moment. So two quite important struggles. The one, I've just come from the eastern coast of South Africa, and there was a struggle going on around the mining of titanium sand by an Australian mining company. And that struggle's been going on for about 20 years now. But some years ago, the community won a very important legal case against the mining company. And the
the finding was that the company had not consulted properly, and the government had not consulted with that community before they granted the license to the Australian mining company. And this sounds very similar to the El Salvador case. And I think it's quite an important, these are important sort of international precedents which we could share with, with communities which are considered poor and which are sitting on big resources. I mean, the other one in South Africa, which is more recent, is the shale gas seismic survey. So this is offshore gas that they want to explore for on the same coastline, basically. And the people in that area who are a rural community, who are dependent on both land and the sea for their livelihoods, have also opposed that. So it's not as simply an environmental opposition, it's also premised on people losing their traditional livelihoods. And in that case, it's also been halted due to the fact that they did not adequately consult before they engaged in this grant of this permission to Shell to do the seismic survey. However, there's been a strong pushback from both government and from political organizations in South Africa. And it's basically along the findings that Marina had, which is that people say, I think the quote was in your presentation, Marina, that unemployment is the most important thing. So we're dealing in South Africa with a massive crisis of unemployment. And the argument put forward by people in positions of power is to say, you have to put the national interest above the interest of a local community. So a local community can't decide that they want a particular form of development or a particular lifestyle. They have to go along with what's in the national interest or in the broader interest. And I'm just intrigued as to whether you think that, well, firstly, whether people also are reflecting on this sort of local versus national development debate and conflict of interest. And secondly, I mean, also to Claire, whether you think that there is a way in which extractives can be done in a way which is environmentally sustainable and is going to benefit the local community, i.e., is it a question of being against extractives, full stop? Like we must not exploit the resources of the earth at all. Or is there a way in which it can be done, which can be what we would say a sort of eco-socialist form of development? Is that possible? Is there a sustainable way of doing extractives, which is economically beneficial? Anyway, sorry, that's quite a long response, but I think these are very important questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Janet. It's, the benefit of these panels is getting people's experience and other cases, which is really, really useful. I'm just conscious that we haven't had, there are a couple of questions in the chat from Marina. So Patrick, if you don't mind, we'll come back to you in a minute. So Claire, there was a question from Claire about the type of livelihood and type of environmental consciousness, how they might be related, and how does environmental consciousness manifest itself? Is it the same across different economies and cultures? And then related to that, we've got a question from Augustine about whether you've done any kind of cross context or cross country comparisons regarding growth and consciousness and impact. So Marina, would you like to?
Yeah, so first I would say that even people who are saying these quotations that I made from my thesis, that people who are saying that employment is the most important thing, sometimes they are also arguing that economic growth is all the time, you know, I don't know, it's not good for the environment. Especially here in Spain, because we had this process of modernization starting at the 60s. So they already know, I mean, they have in their minds or in their collective memories these, you know, unpolluted images of the territory, or also wetlands or some things like that. So they have this contradictory probably thoughts. But when you are looking at these surveys, things are also with this double bind, that economic growth is good and bad for the environment. And when we try to understand what has happened in other countries, we just analyze quantitative data. I mean, I have never done qualitative research in other countries, which I think is the most important thing, not just to see what people think, but also what people do in terms of this environmentalism of the poor, that people is not gonna say that they are environmentalists, but they in fact are, because they live in accordance to the environment. And I think more research is needed in this way, I mean, in this line, I would say, in order to see these contradictions, and also especially what we are doing. Also in this research, that we are also exploring different ways of understanding the environment, because here we are just looking at this aggregated data, but for sure individuals, I mean, poor individuals are living more accordance in the environment because they are not using the car or even the heater. So I think we are going to do more research in this sense, to see what happens between individuals, and of course in other countries. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Marina. Patrick, you had your hand up. Would you like to ask your question? Or
I sort of make a quick point around the unemployment issue, or employment. Kind of what we are saying is that it's not about employment, it's about ownership of the means of production. And the new technologies allow for there to be a distributed production occurring at at the level of the neighborhood. And so it's possible for us to actually establish quite large production systems which are collectively owned, and that's kind of what we should be doing, as opposed to these, some of the jobs that are created are really not, I mean, you want to ask the politicians whether they would ever do a job like that. It's more of an insult than an actual job. Just firstly, what they have to do, and secondly, the amount of money they get paid. But no, because the people are poor, we have to give them essentially what are little more than chattel type jobs, to use the kind of term. And there's a real opportunity for us to actually move beyond this. It doesn't matter if the robots do the production, so long as the community actually owns the robots, is kind of what we're saying. And getting those ideas through institutions, we're finding it very difficult, and it's understandable. We've got a high unemployment rate, so obviously people are concerned, but we don't think that's the answer. We think that the answer is place the assets of the community in the assets of the neighborhood in the hands of the community, and let's look at how neighborhoods can be transformed from just places where commodities are consumed to where commodities are also produced, and that is it possible for us to participate in the market system in some kind of democratic way. Now, we don't know the answers to these things, but we are asking the question, and we're saying we should at least be exploring whether it's possible for there to be some kind of fundamental shift where we place means of production into people's hands. So.
great, thank you, Patrick. I'm conscious that we are now at 1:40, so that's our 40 minutes, which has gone amazingly fast. what I'd just like to do is maybe come back to each of the panelists for some concluding remarks, and perhaps you could pick up, there was a question in the chat from Ageto about the role of institutions in shaping climate concern and economic growth nexus. So if you could give us your kind of concluding comments and then anything relating to institutions, would be great. So if we start with the South African team, I'm not sure who wants to speak, or if you all want to speak.
I guess I can say something, or maybe we can all say something at the same time. I don't know. I think, like, with respect to institutions, you know, I think part of the problem is that, you know, in a sense, by striving in the direction that this project is, you know, and this is using technology as a means of basically taking ownership of more of the basic necessities of the community, that you can then start to establish a different set of values that govern the community, so that you don't have institutions that are predominantly dictated on like means of exchange value and power over, right? To use the words in Claire's presentation, you know, basically domination, so that we're striving toward, in a short sense, freedom. And so that by distributing both the subsistence, and that just basically what I'm saying there is just like the production of what is needed in the community, and that the collective decision making about that is done in a particular way that is inclusive of everyone, that therefore you're basically starting to talk about what Anitra Nolson maybe calls real values, you know, that basically you're trying to abdicate the dictates of the markets, in a sense, to create a different space within that. So yeah, and then, you know, in some sense, you could actually look at that as like a means of circular economy, that you're basically trying to establish a different network of relations within a locality.
Thanks, Tony. Claire, would you like to add any concluding remarks?
Well, I'll try. Thank you for this panel. It's been really interesting to hear other people's presentations. I think, like Tony said, to me, it's about this shift towards greater power with. I mean, that seems to be the case in all of these presentations about. It's about collective action, collective power, and that's always really difficult to establish and to maintain. And I mean, we touched briefly on institutions, and I think, like, the way I understand institutions is that they are a reflection of the existing power relations. So to change an institution, you have to change the power relations which produce them. And at least in the case studies we've got here and the ones I've studied, it's about enabling a collective vision, getting people who might have opposing interests to actually see things differently and work together. And that can shift the power balance in favor of institutions which offer a bit more sustainable livelihoods. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And Marina, would you like to add any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some international institutions like the OECD or maybe United Nations, sometimes with the SDGs, that try to spread or share this common wisdom that economic growth is good for the environment. And in this sense, what we found, and probably the most important thing of our paper, is that this way of understanding the environment, just as the post-materialist thesis does, is kind of distracting, and we should, you know, change the way that we understand the environment and this relationship, especially because they are pretty much related. And I think that's all. Of course, there are other cases, like, I mean, I really like Claire presentation. And there are other cases when institutions try to change this view, and I really appreciate it. And I really like your presentation. And that's all.
Thanks, Marina. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all our presenters. I mean, this has been a very, Janet said it's too short. It has been kind of a massive opportunity to kind of hear about your research, and it definitely has been too short. We were a bit nervous as to how things were going to go today. And I can see that we just need to be in the same room to have carry on these dialogues. So do, feel free to swap email addresses or things in the chat if you want. It's really, as I said, really lovely to meet you virtually. Hopefully we'll get the chance to meet you online. Not online, face-to-face in the future. So thank you very much to all our presenters and to everyone who's kind of attended the panel. Much appreciated. We do have a study group meeting tomorrow. I did put the link in the chat from 3 to 4 p.m. So if anyone wants to come along to that, please do come along. What we're looking to do is think about what sort of areas we want to kind of look into in the future, and whether we want to have a kind of workshop in the autumn. So any thoughts or suggestions for that would be great. And hopefully we'll see you at, say, 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Right. Thank you very much, everyone. Valerie, if you've got anything else to add.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See you tomorrow, hopefully. Bye.
Bye.